February 2023. A Chinese spy balloon drifts across the continental United States. For days, Americans watch it float overhead, a giant white orb carrying surveillance equipment, photographing military bases, drifting wherever the wind takes it. The balloon crossed Montana, home to America's nuclear missile silos. It floated over the Midwest. It was tracked by fighter jets that could have shot it down at any moment, but didn't for days while politicians argued about what to do. The U.S. eventually shoots it down over the Atlantic. China calls it a weather balloon. Nobody believes them. Relations between Washington and Beijing hit their lowest point in decades. Secretary of State Blinken canceled a planned trip to Beijing. Congress demanded answers. Social media exploded with calls for war. But this wasn't the first time American and Chinese aircraft faced off in a dangerous game of espionage and confrontation. And compared to what happened 22 years earlier, the balloon incident was nothing. 22 years earlier, on April 1, 2001, a Chinese fighter jet collided with an American spy plane over the South China Sea. The Chinese pilot was killed. The American plane, crippled, burning, falling from the sky, made an emergency landing on Chinese soil. 24 American crew members were taken prisoner. The most sensitive intelligence aircraft in the U.S. inventory fell into Chinese hands. And the world held its breath, wondering if America and China were about to go to war. This is the Hainan Island Incident, the spy plane crisis that brought two superpowers to the brink, and a warning about what could happen again, any day now. The EP-3 Ares II doesn't look like a spy plane. It looks like a fat, slow, four-engine turboprop, the kind of aircraft you might see hauling cargo or passengers on regional routes. It's based on the venerable P-3 Orion, a plane originally designed to hunt submarines in the 1960s. But inside, it's something else entirely. The EP-3 is stuffed with the most sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment in the American arsenal. Banks of computers, receivers that can intercept radio communications, cell phone calls, radar emissions, antennas that can pinpoint the location of enemy transmitters from hundreds of miles away. When an EP-3 flies near a foreign coastline, it's listening to everything: military communications, naval radar, air defense networks, government transmissions. If it emits an electronic signal, the EP-3 can hear it, record it, and analyze it. The crew that operates this equipment, 24 specialists from the Navy's Fleet Air Reconnaissance Squadron 1, known as VQ-1 World Watchers, are some of the most highly trained intelligence gatherers in the military. They hold top-secret clearances. They know things that could get people killed if revealed. On April 1, 2001, one of these aircraft, Bureau Number 156511, took off from Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, Japan, for a routine surveillance mission over the South China Sea. The crew had done this dozens of times before. Fly to the edge of Chinese airspace, listen, record, go home. The Chinese always sent fighters to shadow them. It was a game both sides had played for years. But today, the game would turn deadly. 5 hours into the mission, the EP-3 was flying at 22,500 feet, about 70 miles southeast of Hainan Island, well outside Chinese territorial waters in international airspace. The crew spotted them first, two Chinese J-82 Finback interceptors launching from Lingshui Airfield on Hainan. Within minutes, the fighters were alongside. This was normal. The Chinese always came up to look. But one of the pilots, Lieutenant Commander Wang, wasn't content to just look. Wang was a hotshot. He had a reputation for aggressive flying, for getting close to American aircraft, for showing off. Previous EP-3 crews had encountered him before. They had photographs of him flying so close they could read the patches on his flight suit. On one previous intercept, Wang had gotten so close that he held up a piece of paper with his email address written on it, visible to the American crew through their windows. He wanted them to know who he was. Today, Wang approached from the rear left and took up station just 10 feet from the EP-3's wing. He saluted the American crew. Then he dropped back about 100 feet, and then he came again. Would you hold your position if a fighter jet was flying 10 feet from your wing? Comment below. On his second pass, Wang closed to within 5 feet. The American crew could see him clearly, shouting something at them, gesturing. What he was saying, they couldn't tell. Lieutenant John Comerford, one of the EP-3E crew members, was watching through the overwing window, taking notes on a clipboard. He had a perfect view of the Chinese fighter, so close he could see the rivets on its fuselage. And then Wang came a third time. This time he misjudged. Flying in the turbulent air behind a 4-engine aircraft is incredibly difficult. The propellers create vortices, invisible tornadoes of spinning air that can flip a smaller aircraft in an instant. Wang got too close. His J-8 was sucked into the propeller wash. The Chinese fighter's nose struck the EP-3E's number 1 propeller. The blade sliced through the J-8's fuselage like a knife through paper. The fighter was cut in half. Lieutenant Comerford, watching from the window, saw it happen. One moment there was an aircraft. The next moment there were 2 pieces tumbling toward the sea, trailing smoke and debris. He saw Wang Wei's ejection seat fire, the pilot punching out of his disintegrating aircraft, but at that speed, at that altitude, with his cockpit possibly crushed by the collision, survival was unlikely. Wang Wei's body was never found. China launched a massive search. 110 aircraft, over 100 warships, more than 1,000 boats, 55,000 people searching 52,000 square miles of ocean. They found pieces of his aircraft. They found his parachute, but not him. In an instant, 8,000 pounds of Chinese jet had become a cloud of shrapnel traveling at 200 miles per hour. And that shrapnel slammed into the EP-3E from every direction. The radome, the nose cone that houses the aircraft's radar, was torn completely off. Shrapnel ripped through the fuselage. The number 1 propeller was destroyed. The number 3 engine was knocked out by flying debris. A wingtip was shattered. The left aileron, critical for controlling the aircraft's roll, was badly damaged. And the EP-3E, with 24 American souls on board, began to die. The aircraft rolled inverted, completely upside down. Lieutenant Shane Osborne, the pilot, fought the controls. The EP-3E was plummeting toward the sea, spinning, shaking violently. Crew members were thrown from their seats. Equipment tore loose from its mounts. In the next few seconds, the aircraft fell 14,000 feet, from 22,500 feet to 8,000 feet, in an uncontrolled dive. Osborne considered ordering the crew to bail out, but they were over water, far from land, in an area where rescue would take hours. Many of them wouldn't survive. He considered ditching in the ocean, but the EP-3E was too heavy, too damaged. It would break apart on impact. There was only one option, Hainan Island, a Chinese military airfield at Lingshui, 20 minutes away. If he could keep the aircraft flying that long, Osborne wrestled the EP-3E out of its dive. The aircraft was shaking so badly it felt like it was going to tear itself apart. 2 engines were out or damaged. The controls were sluggish, unresponsive. There was no working airspeed indicator, no altimeter. He was flying blind. Behind him, the crew knew what they had to do. The EP-3E was carrying some of the most sensitive intelligence equipment and information in the U.S. military. Codebooks, encryption keys, technical manuals. Computer hard drives filled with classified data. If any of it fell into Chinese hands, it would be a catastrophic intelligence failure. They had trained for this. Emergency destruction procedures. Destroy everything. But the equipment wasn't designed to be destroyed quickly. The crew had an axe for smashing electronics, but it was too dull to cut through the hardened cases. They poured hot coffee over computer hard drives, hoping to damage them. They stomped on laptops. They tore documents by hand and threw them out a hatch, watching in horror as some of the papers landed on Hainan Island below. 20 minutes of desperate destruction while the aircraft bucked and shook around them. And then Lingshui Airfield appeared below. This is what real heroes look like, keeping calm when everything is falling apart. Hit like if you agree. Osborne had no flaps, no trim. His airspeed indicator was broken. The aircraft weighed 108,000 pounds, far heavier than it should be for landing. The left aileron was barely responding. He called Mayday on the international distress frequency 15 times. No response from the Chinese. He didn't care. He was landing anyway. The EP-3E touched down at 170 knots, nearly twice the normal landing speed, and somehow stayed on the runway. Osborne stood on the brakes. The aircraft shuddered to a stop. They were down. They were alive. And they were in China. Within minutes, Chinese military vehicles surrounded the aircraft. Soldiers with AK-47s took up positions. The crew was ordered out at gunpoint. Lieutenant Shane Osborne stepped off his crippled aircraft and made one phone call to Pacific Fleet headquarters before the Chinese confiscated his satellite phone. "We're on the ground at Lingshui. All crew accounted for." Then silence. For the next 11 days, the 24 crew members of the EP-3E were held captive on Hainan Island. They were taken to military barracks and separated. Interrogations began immediately. Chinese intelligence officers questioned them for hours about their mission, their equipment, their chain of command. What were they listening to? What had they recorded? What did they know about Chinese military communications? The crew gave nothing. Name, rank, service number, that's all. Their SEER training, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, had prepared them for exactly this situation. They knew the techniques interrogators would use. They knew how to resist. They knew that every piece of information they revealed could endanger other Americans, other missions, other lives. So they stayed silent for 11 days, while their families waited at home, not knowing if they were alive or dead, while diplomats screamed at each other across the Pacific, while the world wondered if this was the start of something much worse. The Chinese government was furious. A Chinese pilot was dead. An American spy plane had landed on Chinese soil without permission. The nationalist public was demanding revenge. State media ran constant coverage, calling the American crew spies and criminals. In Washington, the new administration of President George W. Bush, barely 10 weeks into office, faced its first major international crisis. China demanded an apology. A full, formal apology for the death of Wang and for the invasion of Chinese airspace. The U.S. refused. American officials pointed out that the EP-3E had been in international airspace when the collision occurred, that Wang Wei's reckless flying had caused the crash, that the EP-3E had followed international emergency procedures when it landed without permission. Neither side would budge. Meanwhile, the crew sat in a Chinese military facility being interrogated daily. They gave only name, rank, and service number, just as their SEER, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, training had taught them. The Chinese got nothing. But the Chinese had something far more valuable than information from interrogations. They had the aircraft. While diplomats argued in Washington and Beijing, Chinese intelligence teams were swarming over the EP-3E, photographing every piece of equipment, downloading every hard drive the crew hadn't managed to destroy, cataloging every technical manual, every codebook, every piece of classified material. They had months to study it. The aircraft sat on Hainan for over 3 months before American technicians were allowed to dismantle it. 3 months for Chinese engineers to reverse engineer the most sophisticated surveillance technology in the American arsenal. What did they learn? The full extent has never been publicly disclosed, but intelligence officials later called it one of the worst security breaches in decades. Some estimates suggest the Chinese gained insights into American signals, intelligence capabilities that would have taken them years to develop on their own. The crew had destroyed what they could, but 20 minutes of desperate destruction with a dull axe, hot coffee, and bare hands wasn't enough to erase years of technological development. China got a windfall, and American intelligence had to assume that everything on that aircraft, every technique, every frequency, every capability, was now compromised. After 11 days, a compromise was reached. U.S. Ambassador Joseph Pruher delivered what became known as the Letter of the Two Sorries. America expressed that it was very sorry for the loss of pilot Wang and very sorry that the EP-3E entered Chinese airspace and landed without verbal clearance. It wasn't an apology, not technically. The carefully crafted language allowed both sides to claim victory. The U.S. could say it never apologized. China could say it received the apology it demanded. On April 12, 2001, the crew was released. They flew from Hainan to Guam on a commercial airliner. China insisted that no U.S. military aircraft could pick them up, and then on to Hawaii, and finally home to Whidbey Island, Washington. They were heroes. Lieutenant Shane Osborne received the Distinguished Flying Cross for saving the aircraft and his crew. The entire crew was celebrated for their courage under pressure. But the aircraft stayed behind. China refused to allow the EP-3E to be flown out. After months of negotiations, American technicians were finally allowed to dismantle it on Hainan. The pieces were loaded onto Russian Antonov cargo planes, the only aircraft large enough, and flown back to the United States. The EP-3E was reassembled, repaired, and eventually returned to service. It flew for another 20 years. In October 2024, it was finally retired and sent to the Pima Air and Space Museum in Arizona, where you can see it today. A monument to a crisis that could have been a war. In China, Wang became a martyr. State media called him a guardian of territorial airspace and waters. His photo was everywhere. Schools were named after him. Songs were written about his sacrifice. He became a symbol of Chinese resistance to American aggression. His widow received a personal letter of condolence from President Bush, a gesture that meant little in Beijing, but showed that Washington understood the human cost of what had happened. The incident had profound effects on both countries. For China, it was a humiliation, but also a wake-up call. Chinese military leaders realized that their aging J-8 fighters were no match for modern American aircraft. They accelerated the development of new fighters, new radar systems, new anti-aircraft missiles. The EP-3E incident was one of the sparks that ignited China's massive military modernization. The same modernization that now threatens Taiwan, challenges American dominance in the Pacific, and keeps Pentagon planners awake at night. For America, it was a warning. The days of unchallenged surveillance flights along the Chinese coast were numbered. Chinese intercepts became more frequent, more aggressive. In 2014, a Chinese fighter came within 30 feet of a USP-8 Poseidon and performed a barrel roll. In 2016, 2 Chinese jets came within 50 feet of another EP-3E. The game continues. And every time American and Chinese aircraft dance around each other in the skies over the South China Sea, the ghost of April 1, 2001, is watching. When President Xi Jinping met with President Biden in 2022, he reportedly issued a stark warning. If another collision happened between a U.S. surveillance aircraft and a Chinese fighter, there would be no happy ending. The Chinese don't want another Wang Wei, but they also don't want American aircraft listening to their communications. And America won't stop flying. The South China Sea is too important. Taiwan is too close. China's military buildup is too threatening to ignore. So the flights continue. American reconnaissance aircraft, P-8 Poseidons, EP-3Es, unmanned Global Hawks and Tritons, patrol the edges of Chinese airspace every single day. And Chinese fighters rise to meet them, flying close, testing limits, playing a dangerous game. The intercepts have become more aggressive over time. In 2022 alone, the Pentagon documented over 180 unsafe intercepts by Chinese aircraft, more than the previous decade combined. Chinese pilots fly inverted over American aircraft. They release flares in front of them. They use their jet wash to shake the slower reconnaissance planes. Every single intercept is a potential disaster. Every aggressive Chinese pilot is a potential Wang Wei, one mistake away from killing himself and triggering an international crisis. And unlike 2001, today's China is not a rising power trying to avoid conflict. Today's China has the world's largest navy, Today's China has hypersonic missiles and stealth fighters. Today's China is actively preparing for war over Taiwan. One mistake, one aggressive pilot, one moment of misjudgment. That's all it would take for 2001 to happen again. And next time, with the tensions between America and China at their highest point since the Cold War, the ending might be very different. The crew of the EP-3E didn't ask for a crisis. They were doing their job, the same job American intelligence gatherers have done for decades, monitoring potential adversaries, collecting information that keeps the country safe. When disasters struck, they responded with courage, professionalism, and sacrifice. They destroyed what they could. They protected what they couldn't destroy. They survived an impossible landing. They resisted interrogation for 11 days. And they came home. But the crisis they survived didn't end when they left Hainan Island. It's still playing out today in the skies over the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait, in the war rooms of Beijing and Washington. April 1, 2001 was a warning, a preview of what could happen when two superpowers collide. We didn't listen then. Are we listening now? These 24 Americans faced a hostile nation alone and never broke. Share this video so their courage is never forgotten. Subscribe to Untold War Stories Official for more stories of Americans who held the line.